Hello, and welcome to Public Affairs Public Access. My name is Laura Blackburn, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of Houston. This evening, we're going to look at air quality from the perspective of the citizen, like you and I, the industry, and government. And we are hoping that together we can work out what we need to do. We do have a telephone number for you to call if you're interested. It's 713-807-1794. Once again, it's 713-807-1794. With us are my colleague Ann Herbage with the League of Women Voters and Matt Tejada with Air Alliance Houston. We'll be joined later by Larry Soward, who is a former commissioner with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, Alina Kraft with the Environmental Defense Fund, and Chris Thiele, a partner with Environmental Strategies Group of Bracewell and Giuliani. For those of you who know the League of Women Voters from our election services, let me explain a couple of things. The League does look at issues of community importance. Air quality is one of those. We come to a consensus opinion, and then we sometimes even advocate on those positions. We do this without ever supporting or opposing a particular candidate or party. We are scrupulously nonpartisan. Ann Herbage, tell us about the League and clean air. It's been an important topic for us since 1970.
You are correct, yes. We have been very interested in this probably even before the early 70s, but certainly by that time we started having a position, and obviously we are for clean air.
Tell us why.
Well, it affects the health of our community, our family. It affects our own health. So, of course, we are very interested in that. Since we are also workers, we all have careers, we also like to see the balance in fairness. So we advocate for local and state and national laws that will help ensure that we have good air quality.
Good. So, Matt Tejada, take a minute or two first and tell us about Air Alliance Houston.
Well, Air Alliance Houston, the name has been around for almost 2 years now. Some of the viewers might be more familiar with the organizations which formed Air Alliance Houston. One of those was the Galveston-Houston Association for Smog Prevention, or GASP. GASP had over 20 years of experience here in the Houston area, and it was kind of what we would call a treetops advocacy. GASP did a lot of research, a lot of policy work, worked with regulatory authorities, elected officials, doing that kind of top layer of the advocacy work. After about 10 years of existence, GASP created another organization called Mothers for Clean Air, whose mission was to do the grassroots, to work in communities, doing education, awareness, and helping community members trying to identify and solve the air quality problems in their neighborhoods. A couple of years ago, we thought that those two organizations could do a better job in both of those areas if they unified their efforts a little more closely. So we created Air Alliance Houston, and Air Alliance Houston now has over 30 years of experience of advocating here in the Houston region on air quality issues. We have recently started to branch out a little bit more and get involved in some other sort of environmental issues that maybe are the legacy of air quality problems before, whether it be water quality problems or waste problems. But we're still the Houston region's leading health and clean air advocacy nonprofit. And we serve an important role, I think, both locally and on a wider level, kind of bridging the gap between the local community and national priorities, and between the grassroots needs and the treetops requests that happen a lot of times. So I think we serve a really valuable function for the Houston area.
I think you do too, despite the fact that I serve on your board.
Yeah.
Okay. The Clean Air Act was passed in 1970. Has it had an impact on Houston's air?
Absolutely. I would think, especially over the past decade or so, it's unquestionable that Houston's air, especially when we're talking about ozone, which is the thing that we've normally talked about in Houston when we're talking about air quality, ozone or smog, which is, you can more or less interchange those two terms. They're not exactly the same, but people do anyway. It's unquestionable that the Clean Air Act has delivered the vast majority of the air quality improvements we've seen. We've also seen some more localized improvements around particulate matter, though they're not as much as we'd like to see, and I think we're going to have an increasing challenge with particulate matter as ports and goods movement industries increase around the Houston area. And we've also seen some particular improvements in air toxics levels around the Houston area that are more of a function of local and state efforts. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. We're very far away from crossing the Clean Air Act finish line or any other finish lines that we have locally, whether they be around specific pollutants or just air quality in general.
I have a question for you. Does the climate here have an impact on?
Which climate? The political climate or the weather?
The weather, specifically. Okay. I know the political climate has an effect.
Yeah, has a very big effect.
Yeah.
The climate does because, especially when you're talking about ozone, one thing that a lot of folks don't realize is you don't actually emit ozone. Your tailpipes emit volatile organic compounds, emit particulate matter, but it doesn't emit ozone. Ozone is actually created when your tailpipe or the smokestack or the storage tank or any other thing releases two different chemical substances. One, nitrogen oxide. The other chemical substance is a family of substances called volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. When those two things are present in the air, and we have enough of those two things present in the air in Houston, and really almost any major metropolitan area has enough of those two chemicals in the air at any time to have ozone. It's really the weather that drives ozone events. And Houston actually, for the most part, we have a pretty good weather situation with regards to ozone. You need heat to make ozone, so Houston obviously usually has a whole lot of heat. But a couple other things that you need fairly still air. You don't need a lot of wind. Even a stiff breeze of about 5 or 6 miles per hour, that's too much. It stirs the atmosphere too much because those two chemicals actually need to sit in the atmosphere and cook in the presence of sunlight and heat. So when there's too much wind, they can't do that. Another thing that we're starting to realize is that humidity actually suppresses ozone. So especially during the high summer months when we have fairly moist air coming in at a fairly good rate off of the Gulf of Mexico during most of our days, and it's also bringing fairly clean air off the Gulf of Mexico, that actually suppresses our ozone levels a lot. It helps us. If you look now, and this has always been the case, but especially with the cleanup that the Clean Air Act has driven in the Houston area, if you watch our ozone events, they're usually on the edges of the summer, in the late spring, early summer, and late summer, early fall. And a lot of the times they'll be when we've just gotten a front from the north that has cool air, and it also has air that's loaded with pollution from a lot of places north of us that have not been regulated by the Clean Air Act yet because they're not in non-attainment. And a lot of things that we've been talking about recently on the national stage, whether it's the Clean Air Transport Rule or the Mercury and Air Toxics Rule, those are things that were supposed to be created decades ago. They're just now coming out, and finally they'll start cleaning up some of that air that we get whenever the north wind blows. But traditionally, we get dirty, dry, really good air from making ozone whenever it blows from the north.
What are the worst spots in the Houston area?
Well, obviously, when people think about air quality, air pollution, the worst spots are going to be in our heavily industrialized area because those are the places where you're going to see elevated levels of particulate matter, or PM, especially diesel PM. When we talk about really any of the things you can breathe, diesel PM might very well be the most dangerous thing you can breathe. Those are also the areas where you have elevated levels of air toxics, things like benzene or 1,3-butadiene. There's a whole family of those air toxics, and we're concerned with at least over a dozen of those are particularly pernicious. So anywhere around the ship channel, around the seaport area, or the LaPorte area where there's a big concentration, Texas City, Baytown. But when we're talking about ozone or smog, really our worst areas are not around the ship channel because those pollutants have to go up in the air and they have to mix, and as they're mixing, they're traveling. So the worst areas for ozone are typically northern Brazoria County into Fort Bend County and northwest Harris County over towards the Woodlands. Because by the time that pollution has traveled, reacted in the atmosphere, it's traveled to those areas with our prevailing winds. And a lot of folks don't realize that. They think, well, they're living out in the suburbs, they're not next to a refinery, this whole air quality
They have all
thing
those nice trees.
Right, we're safe, right? And that's also, unfortunately, those are the areas where we have the fewest monitors to tell people ozone's high, you probably shouldn't let your kids go play baseball today, you probably shouldn't have practice inside. So so there's a big perception problem in the Houston area where you think, well, I don't live on the Ship Channel, I don't have to worry about that, and that couldn't be further from the truth.
Okay.
I was about to ask, do these folks know what's happening to them?
I don't think so, and that was something. I'm from the Dallas-Fort Worth area originally. That's where I grew up, and I remember back in the '80s, I would watch the weather, and I would get ozone. I would hear ozone alerts when I remember when I was 5 or 6 years old. The weatherman talking about tomorrow's going to be an air quality day. Ozone's going to be high. Don't mow your lawn in the morning. Try to carpool. That was back in the '80s. That's something that in Houston when I moved here, people still didn't really talk honestly about air quality, and I think a lot of that has changed, specifically in the past 2 or 3 years. I think Airlines Houston, a lot of other groups, League of Women Voters, Bill White being in the mayorship of the city of Houston, I think we really started to speak much more honestly about air quality just in the past several years, and I think it's having an impact. But especially when you get out into the places like Sugar Land or Pearland or Katy or somewhere else, folks still think, well, I'm in the suburbs,
Right.
I don't have to deal with this.
Gosh,
And that's
yeah.
pollution. Air pollution travels.
It does. Yeah.
It moves.
You mentioned the mercury and the air toxic standard. Tell us a little bit about the cross-state air pollution standard.
Well,
where it is.
It's in a bit of a regulatory purgatory right now. So we had this thing called the Clean Air Interstate Rule that was supposed to look at, well, pollution in this state is blowing way over to that state. So even though those plants aren't affecting people locally, maybe they need to clean up because it's affecting people in some other state. And that's really one of the best tools I think the Clean Air Act affords to cleaning up things like power plants or other big sources of pollutants that otherwise would escape a lot of regulatory control. Unfortunately, the first attempt to implement that was rescinded or was thrown out by the court several years ago, but it's mandated that we have to have something that deals with this. So Lisa Jackson's administration at the EPA right now put together the cross-state air pollution rule, I think is the actual name of it now.
I think so.
And she put it out, she published it, or she finalized it just before Christmas, which everyone was excited about. It's a strong rule. A lot of states are involved in it. Texas is included in that. But just between Christmas and New Year's, of course, many states and industry groups sued the EPA on it, including Texas. And it has now been pulled back by the district court in Washington, D.C., and we're going to be solving this in the courts over the next year. So we'll see what the final result is.
I hope you're right that it's just a year.
I hope so too.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a pretty ambitious.
That
and
hasn't
hopeful
happened with the mercury
timeline.
and the air toxic standard.
Right.
Tell us where that is.
Well, that has been finalized, and I do not. I never want to say that it doesn't face any more challenges, but it's certainly on a better path right now than the interstate rule is. And again, both of these rules really scoop up a lot of the biggest polluters that are left in the United States, and the mercury and air toxics rule specifically. It will touch a lot of power plants. A lot of other major industrial processes that just because they've been in maybe a more rural area, which a lot of our coal-burning power plants and a lot of other things, they're not in your major metropolitan areas. They're not in your city centers, and those are the places because that's where the people live. They've received the bulk of attention under the Clean Air Act. So this mercury and air toxics rule will, for the first time, take a much broader look and say, for the entire United States, where are the sources? What are the problems? And we need to do something about limiting those pollutants. And especially with the mercury and air toxics rule, if you look at what industry is going to have to do to meet that rule, but the benefits, both the economic benefits and the health benefits, they're enormous. I mean, this is really will be one of the best things, even if the EPA continues to exist for a century. This will be one of the biggest things the EPA has ever done in its history. It's going to help a lot of people.
It seems to me that the folks who are most distressed about this are the coal-burning power plants.
Well, some of them, and that's been something that's kind of been interesting over the past year or so. And actually, it's something that people in the business community and some of the other power generators have been fairly honest about. One company in particular, Luminant, out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, one of the, I guess, descendants of TXU,
Yes.
has not been as proactive as it probably should have been in cleaning up a lot of their coal-fired power plants over time. It's not a surprise to anybody that coal-fired power plants were going to get cleaned up eventually. And I think a lot of companies have actually been making the investment over time, spreading it out, making their plants cleaner, installing the scrubbers for whatever reason. Luminant has not. They have some very old plants that have not been upgraded. They don't have scrubbers. They don't have selective catalytic reducers. They don't have the things that, while they're expensive, the things they're taking out of the air save us millions and millions of dollars in health costs. It takes out, things like mercury, things like air toxins, things like sulfur dioxide, things that a lot of other plants have. And now some companies, such as Luminant, are holding the bag and are crying foul, and they're not getting away with it. People are calling them out. Even the Houston Chronicle, some of their business columnists, called Luminant out and said, no, this is, if Luminant's in trouble right now, it's because you haven't been running your business as well as it should have been. This is not the EPA's fault that you're holding the bag on this. This is your own fault. You guys should have seen this coming, and you should have been preparing for it.
We're going to take a break. But first, we invite you to visit this website for more information on the League's work with air quality. Specifically, we'd like for you to go to www.peoplenotpolluters.org. What you will find there is the Clean Air Promise. The Clean Air Promise has been signed by several thousand people, and what it promises is to safeguard our air quality. We hope you'll go there and sign the promise. When we come back in just a minute, you'll meet Lena Kraft, Larry Soward, and Chris Thiele. Remember to give us a call with your comments and questions. Once again, the number is 713-807-1794. We'll be right back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I'm Laura Blackburn with the League of Women Voters, and I am now joined by Larry Soward, former commissioner of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, Alina Kraft of the Environmental Defense Fund, and Chris Teeley, a partner in the Environmental Strategies Group with Bracewell and Giuliani. I want to remind you to call with your questions and comments. The number 713-807-1794. I'm holding up, Larry, an issue of the Texas Observer. Have you ever seen this issue?
I think I have.
Okay, let me tell you what it says. It says, Agency of Destruction. Texas Environmental Commission serves its customers well. Too bad they're not the public. Now, do you think that's an accurate description of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality?
Laura, it's probably skewed a little bit.
Oh, I suspect it is.
I mean, obviously, the Commission on Environmental Quality, the TCEQ, historically has had the reputation of being very pro-industry. But that's because Texas is very pro-industry, and its government, the legislature, the elected officials are very pro-industry. And so it's not unreasonable to think that the agencies that regulate the different things in the state would not have the same mantra as the government does and the philosophy of the state. But it's probably not fair to totally characterize it as that, because in the agency there is a tremendous staff who's dedicated day in and day out to do the best they can do to protect the environment and the public health of this state. And they do that with limitations imposed upon them, but they do it very well. So it's kind of a mixed criticism that I would have, not quite as harsh as the Texas Observer.
Chris, how do you feel about TCEQ?
Well, I represent chemical plants, refineries, electric utilities, and other industries before the TCEQ, whether it be getting a permit or in an enforcement action, and have dealt with them, deal with them routinely on a frequent basis. And I find, specifically talking about the area of air quality, which is where I practice, I think you find that TCEQ is actually quite stringent. I mean, I also practice in other states, and I would say, take for instance what we call the Minor New Source Review Program. That's the minor air permitting program, which is really left up to the state to design that program. There's very little in the Federal Clean Air Act that tells the state how it has to craft that program. And the state of Texas is quite strict in the way it goes about establishing its Minor New Source Review Program. It requires what we call best available control technology for all minor sources. If you go to several other states, that's not the case.
Why don't you tell us what a minor source is?
A minor source is a source that emits below a certain level of pollutant. And why I focused on that is that really it is the state is at much more discretion to design that program, whereas the major New Source Review Program is laid out much more prescriptively in the Clean Air Act. And so states there are running a program that is designed really by EPA and then carried out by the states.
Do you find, like Larry, that the staff is very good?
Yes, yes. I mean, they work very hard to do their jobs. And like I think probably most governmental agencies, I agree with Larry that they do have limitations, but I find that the state agency, TCEQ, is equipped with very capable and hardworking staff.
Good. Larry, how do EPA and TCEQ work together?
Well,
or do they?
For the past couple of years, we've seen a very antagonistic relationship between Texas and the EPA. In the last couple of years, EPA has proposed or developed some very significant initiatives or efforts that are intended to better protect the air quality or the environmental quality and the public health of this state, including the cross-state air pollution rule, the mercury rules, the ozone standards. But what we've also seen in the last couple of years is an unprecedented aggressive effort by Texas to oppose those efforts by EPA, from everything to filing over 24 lawsuits. And so that has naturally caused a very antagonistic approach between EPA and TCEQ, when just the opposite should be the case. EPA and Texas should be genuine partners in developing regulations and implementing regulations that will protect the environment and the public health. And if Texas will sit down and be the partner that it can be and should be, I think much of this time and effort and vast numbers of dollars that we're spending fighting the regulations could be used more to put in place regulations that would benefit Texas and at the same time protect the environment and public health. So the relationship the last 2 years has been very unproductive. It's been very antagonistic. And unfortunately, I don't see that changing for some time to come.
Would you like to comment about that?
I would. I definitely agree with Larry that we are in a time where the relationship between TCEQ and EPA is much more strained than we've seen in
Many years.
Many years, and so no question. I guess where I may differ is what's the cause of that. And I think that really the cause of that is EPA's aggression with respect to Texas, and yes, Texas has challenged well over a dozen EPA actions, and there's current litigation ongoing. I think that's a not unprecedented move by the state, but for the fact that EPA has become much more aggressive. I think two quick examples are one that Matt mentioned earlier, the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, often referred to as CSAPR. I mean, here you had a rule that was proposed. Texas was not included in it. The proposed rule did not include a budget for SO2 emissions for the state of Texas. But yet EPA passes a final rule in July of 2011 that does include Texas. And for the first time in July of 2011, Texas sees a budget under the CSAPR rule. And this is a rule that then was going to take effect beginning January 1st of this year. So we have a rule, by anyone's, I think, a measure, a very significant rule, allowing approximately 5 months to come into compliance. So we're seeing, the EPA really not go through the appropriate public comment process that's required. And so I think it's not surprising that faced with things like that, TCEQ is responding aggressively in its own right. You have other unprecedented attacks on the state air permitting programs that have been around since the mid-1990s, programs that were developed to balance both environmental protection and economic growth, and that have been successful in the state at reducing air emissions. The EPA, after waiting and sitting by and not doing anything with respect to these rules, in 2010 decides to disapprove them. And so I think, given those actions by EPA, it's not surprising, and I think justified, that TCEQ in the state of Texas is challenging those actions.
I think Alina or Larry needs to respond as to why EPA did what they did.
Well, I guess there are a couple of things. One is that I guess the assertion is that EPA has been reining down regulations, particularly since Obama came into to be president. The reality is that all of these rules should have been in place many years ago, but the rules that were recommended to be implemented were in some cases thrown out or vacated by federal judges because they didn't meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act. And with regard to the flexible permitting issue, the reason that in 2010 that EPA finally disapproved of flexible permits is because they were sued by industry to take a stand on flexible permits. And so, the business community got what they asked for, which was, they wanted some clarity in the flexible permitting process. They had received notice. All of the industries that had flexible permits had received notices that the permits that they had were not legal. And so, the idea that that all of a sudden we're sort of burdened, encumbered with all of these rules is a misrepresentation, I think, of reality, which is that in some cases, decades, these rules have been proposed in plan, public comment has gone out, and they were expected all of this time. And it's been up to industry to maintain or to recognize that they're going to have to meet and comply with these rules that are coming down.
Larry, speak not only to that, but then lead into what you've done on the Sunset Commission review.
Well, let me say, follow up to what Elena said in response to something Chris said about Texas being attacked and EPA focusing on Texas. Many would say that was done for political reasons. But let me suggest a more rational basis, and that is Texas has one of the largest, if not the largest, industrial complexes in the nation, where ozone and particulate matter and toxics are prevalent. And it would make sense for EPA to focus on an area that has such a significant impact on the environment. The same thing is true with the cross-state air pollution. The same thing is true with mercury. Texas produces more mercury out of our power plants than anywhere else in this nation. So it only makes sense to focus to some extent on Texas. We forget that EPA is adopting national standards that apply to every state in this nation, from Alaska to Hawaii to Florida and Texas. And only Texas says we don't want these regulations to apply to us. And Chris suggested that Texas gets blindsided with the CSAPR regulation. Texas was in the Clean Air Interstate rule. Texas was given notice on the CSAPR rules that EPA was going to consider whether or not to continue Texas under those regulations. So to say that Texas was blindsided, I think is not quite the case, because Texas has been in the care and even the CAMR, the Clean Air Mercury Act or rule, since it was first adopted. So this is nothing new to Texas. Texas just decided to draw the line in the sand and fight it.
Who enforces the federal rules in Texas?
Well, the way it's supposed to work, Texas, back when it accepted what's known as delegation of the federal, let's talk about air, the Federal Clean Air Act, Texas said, we want to implement and enforce the Federal Clean Air Act and regulations within the border of Texas. And EPA said, and entered into an agreement with Texas, that EPA would allow Texas to do that as long as Texas would, abide by the rules and regulations associated with the Clean Air Act, and gives Texas millions of dollars every year to do that. So TCEQ, the regulatory agency in the state, is the one who has agreed to implement and enforce the Clean Air Act provisions. Now, the Federal Clean Air Act says, though, when a state fails to do that, after being notified by EPA that they're not complying with the Clean Air Act regulations, then the EPA can step in and enforce the federal law as they are required to do under federal law. So
Chris, speak to us about why EPA stepped in.
Well, I think in most contexts that they have not stepped in to take over programs. There's a small exception with respect to greenhouse gases, which they have in fact done that. But I think that the areas where they've disapproved part of Texas's program, which is different than them coming in and saying we're going to take over that program, we're not to that stage yet. Again, is I think just a change in philosophy by EPA, because again, I mean, it is correct that a lawsuit by industry did result in a settlement agreement that forced EPA's hand to come down with a ruling on these programs. It's also true that the Clean Air Act provides that that EPA has 18 months, not 18 years, 18 months to approve or disapprove these programs that they received. And I believe it was in one case 1994 and maybe another 1996. So it is hard for me to see how EPA could, without just a change in philosophy and a change in approach, could take this action after it saw, I think in Texas over that 15 years we saw 160 or so flexible permits issued, many of which go to EPA for review. So I think that it is just a change in philosophy by EPA, especially at the EPA Region 6 level, and that's what we're finding now. Industry having to adjust to losing these permitting mechanisms, which were really designed to account for the fact that Texas has a very strict permitting program. And so these programs were designed to provide some flexibility under those programs.
Laura, I agree with Chris. I think it is a result of a change of philosophy and practice at EPA. EPA finally has come to the point where they've said the Clean Air Act and the regulations adopted under it must be complied with. Texas, we don't think you're complying with them, so either change what you're doing or we will have to step in and do something. And tell Texas, you agreed to do that when you took these programs, so go do it. And I agree. I think EPA has finally matured to the environmental agency it was intended when it was created.
Now, Larry, we're coming to you, Alina. Just hold on. Tell us about the Sunset Commission.
Well, the TCEQ went under sunset this last session, and sunset's a process in Texas state government where state agencies are reviewed every 12 years approximately to determine whether they ought to be continued or not. And if yes, are there any changes that need to be made structurally to the agencies and procedurally? TCEQ was under sunset last session. Everyone expected it to be a very
Pro forma?
No, actually, given the EPA relationship, everyone expected it to be very intense, and it was to a large extent. But, again, not that much came out of the sunset process for TCEQ. There were a few very good things. We got, when I say we, some folks that were pushing some changes on the TCEQ sunset were able to get the legislature to agree to increase the penalties for violations of environmental permits from $10,000 a day to $25,000 a day. Mm-hmm. We're able to get the legislature to tell the TCEQ, go redo the very ineffective compliance history program, things like that. But on the other hand, side of the coin, there were some things not so good that happened. The Office of Public Interest Counsel, which represents the public interest and citizens in this state, got limitations placed on it as to what it can do in the agency to assist the public. State agencies are now prohibited from participating in contested case hearings as a party opposing a permit or an order. Discovery for any parties in a hearing is now limited, whereas previously they weren't. The one good thing that was attempted that didn't happen was there was a real effort to completely eliminate contested case hearings at the TCEQ, cutting out any real opportunity for interested stakeholders and the public to go in and take a position on a permit or an enforcement matter or whatever. Luckily, that didn't pass. But overall, pretty much status quo with the TCEQ for 12 more years.
How are they implementing the law that was passed?
Well, on a number of things, they are proceeding with rules to put in place the things that the legislature told them to do. There are some things that they are making a pro forma effort in complying with what the legislature did in the Sunset Act. A perfect example is the Sunset Commission recommended and the legislature adopted a provision that said that the TCEQ would put its enforcement policy into rule. A lot of the environmental groups and citizen groups worked very hard to try to get a provision where the TCEQ would be required to put its entire penalty policies into rule so everyone would know the rules of the game. The legislature didn't do that. They said the TCEQ would have to put a statement of general enforcement. Well, the TCEQ has interpreted that as it's written. They adopted a rule that very generally says what their enforcement policy is, and they have continued to refuse to put the penalty policy in rule. So they're definitely complying with the things that they have to do to implement what the legislature told them to do, but they're certainly in some instances using their interpretive discretion as to what that means.
Alina, finally it's your turn. We're going to shift to the Mercury Rule.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about it and what your organization and or you think about it.
Okay. Well, the Mercury and Air Toxics Standard is a rule that is designed to set emission limits for metals like mercury, arsenic, chromium, nickel, and acid gases from oil.
Give us an example of an acid gas.
Hydrogen fluoride.
Good.
And and they're designed to set these emission limits for oil or coal-fired electric generating units. Now, this is important because the majority of mercury emissions into the air from industrial sources comes from power plants, which is what this rule regulates. And in Texas, it's particularly important because in Texas, we have 7 of the top 25 highest mercury emitters in the nation. So, with respect to, the national theater, Texas has really been a bit of a laggard in terms of keeping the electric generating units up to date with regard to emission controls.
Well, I understand, though, that Texas may not have kept up all that much, though I think some of them have, but certainly others in other states have kept up. Tell me the health effects.
Well, the health effects of mercury and some of the metals are devastating. Mercury in particular is devastating to unborn fetuses. And the reason it's devastating is because mercury is a potent neurotoxin, meaning that it affects the nervous system and can impair proper brain development. Actually, mercury toxicity was known about as early as the 1800s. The term mad as a hatter was actually a result of the hat-making industry. The folks who used different compounds on the animal pelts were actually exposed to mercury in the fumes from that process. And so, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, Mad as a Hatter, actually originated from a case profile in toxicology on mercury specifically. So that's one very important pollutant that's covered under this rule. Arsenic, chromium, some of these other metals, they're known to cause, thought or suspected to cause cancer. And so we want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to limit the amount of those compounds that are getting out into the air that we're all breathing, or that get into the environment and can then cause damage.
Chris, what is your view of the rule, the mercury rule?
Well, I believe it's similar. That rule is similar to the others. I mean, Elena said, industry should not be surprised that these rules are required by the Clean Air Act and are coming down the pipe, but many of them having been delayed by court action. And I agree with that. And so it's not the fact that these rules are coming out, such as the utility MAC standard or the cross-state air pollution rule. It's how they're being developed and how EPA is justifying those rules. You talked about the health benefits of the Mercury MAC rule. Well, if you look at the rule actually and how EPA justifies that rule, you look at the health benefits, they rely largely on particulate matter emission reductions as the primary health benefit from that rule. And the surprising thing is, if you look at almost any rule EPA passes, they rely on those same particulate matter emission reductions to justify the health benefits, whether it be ozone, any new national ambient air quality standard that EPA may pass. A large percentage of the health benefits are tied to particulate matter emission reductions. The issue is that these are, in many cases, the same particulate matter emission reductions relied upon for one NAAQS standard that are relied upon for another MAC standard. So I think there are definitely some questions that we're going to see played out in the courts, hopefully, that really about how EPA is going about developing these standards. There's, the MAC standard is another issue, is all about looking at what is the best performing source out there. And we're then going to regulate everyone else down to the best performing source, and that's how the Clean Air Act is structured. But there's this interesting way that EPA has gone about determining the best performing source, is that they find one set of best performing sources for mercury, another best performing sources for a hydrogen fluoride, and another set of best performing sources for the other pollutants. So what you end up with at the end of the day is no one set of best performing sources that are meeting the regulations that EPA then comes out with. So the result of that is some extremely high cost, and in many cases standards that just can't be met, and that will be result in the shutdown of plants.
Elena?
So I guess were a lot of things there. One thing is that, this rule addresses power emissions from power plants that in some cases have not made any pollution controls or have not met any pollution control requirements. They were grandfathered into the Clean Air Act when it was developed in the 1970s. And the idea under this grandfathering of these power plants was that, well, by roughly 2007, they would no longer be in operation. Well, what's happened is that some of those power plants are still in operation. And so when you look at installing control technologies on power plants, which, actually 11 of the 15 largest coal fleet owners have said that it's possible to do, and they've already taken the steps to do it. So, there's, I guess, some contention about, between industry that some are doing it and have already done it, whereas others are saying it's too expensive for them. But the reality is that if there are plants that are closing, the average age of that plant that's going to close is 51 years. And so many of those plants are coal-fired power plants, and one of the things about those plants is that because they're so old, they're very inefficient and they're very costly to operate. And so when you have an EPA regulation, it seems very easy to say, well, we're going to shut down because of this EPA regulation, whereas the reality is, I believe that the low cost of natural gas is a much bigger threat to those plants than any EPA air rule that comes down. So there are other issues involved in terms of why a plant may or may not close or shut down.
Larry, you were a commissioner with TCEQ. Did you ever shut down a plant?
No.
Do you think what if a company really can't afford, like Luminant, I don't think can, to put in these additional requirements? What would TCEQ do?
If there was a legitimate demonstrated issue about whether or not a permittee, whether they're a power plant or a gas station or anything else, couldn't meet certain requirements, whether it be a permit or a standard, the TCEQ typically will work with that entity through perhaps a compliance agreement or some other formal mechanism to allow them some ability to keep operating and see if there can be other options available or if there can be revenue sources available that would allow them to make certain changes. Many times those compliance agreements or those, efforts between the violator and the TCEQ may cover a significant period of time when there are limited or no funds available. But the TCEQ is not going to come in and shut somebody down. They haven't, to my knowledge, they've never done it and not likely to do it. But they are going to insist that there be some kind of orderly effort, good faith effort, to try to get into compliance if and when the resources become available to make the necessary adjustments that need to be made.
I think what he said is true, Chris. Do you object to that?
I mean, I don't think I disagree necessarily that TCEQ, I'm not aware of them going in and shutting down a facility. But I go back, I mean, I think we're kind of mixing maybe TCEQ permitting and enforcement versus federal regulations. And so, I mean, you don't have to take my just opinion on these federal regulations. I mean, we can just look back at what happened last week. And that is with the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, one of EPA's major rules. Industry states filed a petition to stay that rule, which would have gone into effect January 1st of this year. The standard to obtain a stay is that one must show that they will suffer irreparable harm, a very high standard, and then two, that they will are likely to succeed on the ultimate merits of the case. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals stayed the CSAPR rule.
For how long?
Well, they're requiring briefing, I believe, in April. So yeah, they're on a fast track. As in any court that would stay a rule is going to act as
it's a temporary stay, isn't it, until they hear from both sides?
True, but in order to grant us, I mean, stays are requested all of the time. In any appeal, a stay is requested. In the last 20 years, there have only been 3 stays issued to a federal environmental regulation. So this is something very uncommon with a very high standard that those appealing the rule must show irreparable harm. And so in this case, the D.C. Court of Appeals last week found that CSAPR would result in irreparable harm.
Well, they may decide that once they get through.
No, they had to find that as a prerequisite to granting the stay.
What do you expect? Excuse me.
Laura,
go ahead.
I would say too, and I don't know about the 20-year period, but in major environmental cases in the past, courts have granted stays only to come back and uphold the regulations. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the fact that a stay was granted. You're correct that it was temporary until April, or well, actually beyond that when they make a decision. But the other thing we need to remember is that the court that granted the stay is the same court that told EPA to go do something different than the CARE regulation. And that's where the Clean Cross State came from, was the Third Court of Appeals telling EPA, this isn't good enough, go do something else. So I'm not putting too much stock in the fact that they granted a stay. I think that was the easiest thing for them to do, given the time crunch that they were in. But I believe in the end EPA will prevail based on the law.
I think EPA agrees with you. Whether Chris does
I'm sure
or
they
not.
do. I'm sure they do. I think there's others that would agree with me that, that there are some problems with the rule.
You were saying we were confusing things a moment ago when we were talking about TCEQ enforcing these rules and assuming that they enforce the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, as assuming that ultimately it goes forward, and assuming that the Mercury Rule is also given to TCEQ to enforce. Do you see any problem with job loss as a result?
Well, I mean, I think that, we look at, the industrial sector. I mean, we can look at the, Houston Ship Channel, the refining, the chemical, other industries. They are being, seeing forces from multiple directions here from an environmental regulatory view. Is that one, they are being, these rules like the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule and the Utility MACT are going to increase energy prices, and this industrial sector is very energy intensive, so it's going to drive up the cost of doing business. At the same time as we see this regulation of the electric utilities, we're also seeing the direct regulation of these industries. They are also subject to their own MACT standards there's a industrial boiler MAC that almost every large industry will have to come into compliance with. You're also seeing greenhouse gas regulation that we haven't got into. Would probably be an entire segment of its own that is adding another layer of permitting that these industries must go through. And then in addition, you're seeing what we talked about earlier, these permitting programs that allow these industries to make minor changes within their facility without having to go through a timely permitting or a time-consuming permitting process now being disapproved by EPA. So the collection of that, I do think, is putting a strain on these industries that the industrial goods are key to this country's economic development, and also industries that not only directly employ a lot of people, but also result in many indirect jobs for suppliers and distribution and sale of their goods. So I do think, and again, it's not just the fact that there are regulations. I think it's some of the concerns over how these regulations are being developed and what they require. But representing industry, I know that once they're on the books, they will commit serious resources to comply with those regulations.
Let me ask you this. Since the rule has been passed, which hasn't been very long in all fairness, I've seen a lot of material with the concerns that you have, how it's implemented, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't seen very much about the rule, the standards themselves. Do you agree with the standards, disagree with them? What is your...
Which rule?
The mercury rule.
I mean, that's a very, I think, complex question. I think even those that are being regulated are really still evaluating that. They're looking at, seeing where they stand. You have, units burn different types of coal, for instance. Some may burn Texas lignite, some may burn Powder River Basin subbituminous coal. I mean, there's a variety of coals, and to some extent they have differing limits. So I think you may see where different segments of the utility sector have different reactions, and so I think, but I think they're still in an evaluation point. I think one of the main concerns, and I think there was a little bit of relief in the rule, but not significant, was timing to compliance. I mean, a lot of these rules will require significant capital investment. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars at an individual power plant. And that can't be done overnight. That requires...
I'm sorry to stop you.
Oh,
we could go on another half hour, clearly. We hope that you've enjoyed our air quality discussion and that we've given you at least some tools to form an informed opinion about this issue. As always, we invite you to go to our website, www.lwvhouston.org, for reliable, nonpartisan information about our air quality. In just a second, we'll be showing you our guests' websites, and we'll hope that you will take the time to visit those as well. I'm Laura Blackburn with the League of Women Voters, and I wish you a good night.